They didn't go looking for ghosts. They weren't chasing urban legends or filming cheap thrills for the internet. Most of them entered abandoned military bases out of curiosity. Historians, photographers, former contractors, even locals who thought they knew these places well. But something about these sites was different. Long after the bases were shut down, after warning signs faded and gates rusted open, people began reporting the same unsettling changes, not while they were inside, but after they left. Sudden headaches, heat with no source, a metallic smell that seemed to follow them home. Sleep became difficult. Dreams became vivid. Familiar places began to feel wrong. Some described time behaving strangely, minutes stretching into hours, entire sections they couldn't remember walking through at all. What makes these stories disturbing isn't fear, it's consistency. Different people, different locations, different decades, yet the same symptoms, the same silence, the same sense that something had been carried out with them. Tonight, we're examining true accounts from abandoned U.S. military sites, places built for war, secrecy, and survival, and the people who entered them and never returned the same. They didn't go looking for ghosts. They weren't chasing urban legends or filming cheap thrills for the internet. Most of them entered abandoned military bases out of curiosity. Historians, photographers, former contractors, even locals who thought they knew these places well. But something about these sites was different. Long after the bases were shut down, after warning signs faded and gates rusted open, people began reporting the same unsettling changes, not while they were inside, but after they left. Sudden headaches, heat with no source, a metallic smell that seemed to follow them home. Sleep became difficult. Dreams became vivid. Familiar places began to feel wrong. Some described time behaving strangely, minutes stretching into hours, entire sections they couldn't remember walking through at all. What makes these stories disturbing isn't fear, it's consistency. Different people, different locations, different decades, yet the same symptoms, the same silence, the same sense that something had been carried out with them. Tonight, we're examining true accounts from abandoned U.S. military sites, places built for war, secrecy, and survival, and the people who entered them and never returned the same. There are places in the United States that don't appear on tourist maps. No gift shops, no guided tours, no plaques explaining what once happened there. They sit behind rusted fences, half swallowed by forests or deserts, their warning signs bleached by decades of sun and neglect. To most people, they're just abandoned military bases, leftovers from wars that officially ended long ago. But for those who have walked inside them, these places are remembered for very different reasons, because something about them doesn't stay behind. Across the U.S., people who have entered decommissioned military facilities have reported changes that didn't begin with fear, but with subtle discomfort. A pressure in the head, a sudden wave of heat in cool air, a smell, metallic, chemical, burned, appearing where it shouldn't exist. And most unsettling of all, these sensations didn't end at the gates. During the Cold War, the United States built thousands of military installations across the country, missile silos buried deep underground, weapons depots hidden in forests, research facilities sealed behind concrete and steel. Many of these sites handled materials the public was never fully told about: high explosives, chemical agents, experimental systems, and, in some cases, accidents that were quietly classified and sealed away. When these facilities were shut down, they weren't restored. They were abandoned. Doors welded shut, tunnels flooded, records redacted. What remains today are structures designed for war, not decay. And some believe that distinction matters. In the early 2000s, a former civilian contractor, we'll call him Mark, returned to the remains of a military storage depot in the American Southwest. He had worked near the site in the late 1980s, during a brief period when parts of the facility were still operational. By the time he returned, the base had been closed for nearly a decade. Mark wasn't chasing a story. He wasn't filming content. He simply wanted to see what had become of a place that once dominated his daily life. The perimeter fence was broken. Warning signs hung crooked, their lettering barely readable. Inside, the air felt unusually still, not silent, but heavy, as though sound struggled to travel. As he moved deeper into the complex, Mark noticed something strange. The temperature didn't make sense. Despite the cool desert evening, certain sections of the base felt warm, uncomfortably so. Not sunlight, not trapped heat, just warmth. He later described it as standing near machinery that should have been powered off decades ago. Inside one of the storage bunkers, Mark stopped abruptly. There was a smell. At first he thought it was rust, then oil, then something sharper. A chemical tang mixed with something burned, like scorched metal and plastic. It was familiar, too familiar. Mark hadn't smelled it since his final year working near the depot, the year an incident occurred that no one was ever allowed to discuss. At the time, they were told it was a minor containment failure, no injuries reported, no public record. Standing there years later, the same odor hung in the air, despite the bunker being empty. No barrels, no machinery, no visible source, just bare concrete and darkness. Mark left the bunker after what felt like several minutes. When he checked his watch, nearly 40 minutes had passed. He had no memory of standing still, no memory of exploring further, just a gap.
At home that night, the smell returned. His clothes were clean. His shoes had been left outside, yet the odor lingered, faint, metallic, burned, following him from room to room. Sleep didn't come easily. When it did, the dreams began. Over the next few weeks, Mark experienced changes he couldn't explain. Sudden headaches without warning, heat sensations in enclosed spaces, vivid dreams of underground corridors he didn't recognize. Most disturbing was a recurring image, a long concrete hallway, lights flickering, and something behind him that never made a sound. Mark never claimed to see an apparition. He never said the place was haunted. He only said this: "Something about that base stayed with me. It didn't feel supernatural. It felt unfinished." He never returned. And Mark's experience was not unique. When researchers began comparing reports from other abandoned military sites, a pattern started to emerge, one that would only grow more unsettling with time. What troubled researchers wasn't the intensity of Mark's experience, it was how familiar it sounded. When accounts from other abandoned military sites were examined, places hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles apart, the same details surfaced again and again. Not ghosts, not voices, not shadows, but sensations. Heat with no measurable source, smell without origin, time that refused to behave normally, and changes that didn't begin until people had already left.
In 2011, a freelance photographer named Evan Holloway traveled to the remains of a Cold War-era coastal radar station along the northeastern United States. The site had once been part of an early warning system, scanning the Atlantic for aircraft that never came. By the time Evan arrived, the facility had been abandoned for more than 30 years. The concrete structures still stood, weathered but intact. Wind moved through broken windows. Salt air coated everything in a fine, corrosive film. Evan was experienced. He had photographed abandoned hospitals, factories, even prisons. This place felt different the moment he stepped inside. Inside the main radar building, sound behaved strangely. Footsteps felt muted. His camera shutter sounded distant, as though the walls absorbed noise instead of reflecting it. He later described the silence as active, not empty, but aware. As Evan climbed a stairwell toward the radar platform, the temperature rose with each level. By the time he reached the top, sweat had soaked through his shirt, despite the cold ocean air outside. Then came the smell. Burned wiring, hot dust, and something sharp and metallic that stung the back of his throat. Evan took several photos from the platform.
Later, reviewing them at home, he noticed something unsettling. In one frame, only one, there was a dark distortion behind the radar mount. Not a shape, not a figure, more like absence. A section where the light bent wrong, swallowing detail instead of reflecting it. The following frame, taken seconds later, showed nothing. Evan dismissed it as a camera glitch. He wouldn't do that again. In the days following his visit, Evan began experiencing vivid auditory hallucinations, not voices, mechanical sounds. Low humming, distant electrical buzzing, the rhythmic clicking of equipment starting up, always as he drifted toward sleep. Medical tests showed nothing abnormal, but the symptoms escalated. He became sensitive to enclosed spaces. Elevators triggered panic. Basements caused nausea. Most disturbing was the heat. Evan would wake in the middle of the night convinced the room was on fire, heart racing, skin burning, only to find the temperature completely normal. After 6 months, he sold his photography equipment. He never entered another abandoned site.
Not all encounters involved individuals. In 2016, a small group of urban explorers entered a decommissioned munitions handling facility in the Midwest. 5 people, different backgrounds, different levels of experience. They explored together, entered together, left together. At first, nothing seemed unusual, until weeks later. Each member of the group later reported changes, but not to one another, at least not initially. One experienced recurring nosebleeds with no medical explanation. Another developed insomnia paired with vivid, repeating dreams of underground corridors. A third reported a constant metallic taste that lingered for months. The fourth refused to discuss what happened. The fifth eventually admitted something none of the others expected. They had all noticed the same thing: burned metal, chemical residue, heat. Always heat, even though none of them had mentioned it during the visit. When they finally compared notes, the realization unsettled them more than the site itself. They stopped meeting. 2 left the urban exploration community entirely. Across dozens of cases, one detail repeats with unnerving consistency. Whatever people experience does not peak inside the site. It follows them home. Symptoms emerge days later. Dreams intensify weeks later. Behavioral changes stretch on for years.
Former military psychologists reviewing these reports have suggested stress responses or environmental exposure. But there's a problem. Many of those affected showed no immediate fear response during their visits, no panic, no shock. The reaction came later, as if something had been delayed. Why would places designed for secrecy, containment, and extreme conditions leave such a psychological imprint? And why do these effects begin only after people leave? Some researchers believe the answer lies not in ghosts, but in memory. Not human memory, environmental memory. The idea that intense events can imprint themselves onto physical spaces, replaying fragments long after the people are gone. If that's true, then abandoned military bases may not be empty at all. By the time researchers began taking these accounts seriously, one conclusion had already formed. Whatever was happening inside abandoned military sites wasn't random. It followed rules, not written ones, but repeated patterns. And nowhere was that pattern clearer than in the case of a man who never meant to explore at all.
In the late 1990s, Daniel Price worked as a private security contractor assigned to a decommissioned military installation in the western United States. The base was officially inactive. No personnel, no operations. Daniel's job wasn't to patrol, it was to observe. His post sat just outside a sealed underground access point. The entrance had been welded shut years earlier. He was told very little about what lay beneath it, only that it was important nothing disturbed it. For months, Daniel's shifts were uneventful. Quiet nights, empty desert, still air. Then, gradually, things changed. It started with heat. Standing near the sealed entrance, Daniel noticed the air felt warmer, sometimes by several degrees. Not enough to be alarming, just enough to register. He reported it. No action was taken. Soon after, Daniel began hearing sounds that didn't behave normally. Low vibrations, a distant mechanical hum. Not loud enough to echo, not consistent enough to record. He would step away from the entrance and the sound would vanish. Step closer and it would return. Daniel never claimed the base was active. He said something inside it felt ready. The smell arrived weeks later. Burnt insulation, chemical residue, the kind of odor associated with overheated machinery. Daniel checked the sealed doors. No gaps, no vents, no leaks. Yet the smell lingered, strongest at night. He began developing headaches during his shifts, then nosebleeds, then a constant pressure behind his eyes. Daniel's contract ended after 8 months. He left the site relieved, convinced whatever he'd experienced would fade. It didn't. At home, the symptoms followed him. He began waking at the same time every night, 3:17 a.m., always drenched in sweat. Always with the same sensation, heat rising from below. His dreams became disturbingly specific. Concrete corridors, heavy steel doors, a sense of standing guard over something he wasn't allowed to see. Daniel sought medical help. Scans showed nothing abnormal. Psychological evaluations suggested delayed stress response. But Daniel insisted on one detail that troubled doctors. He had never felt afraid during his assignment, only afterward.
By the early 2000s, a small number of researchers began exploring a controversial idea. Not hauntings, not trauma, but residual containment. The theory suggests that places designed to contain dangerous materials, chemical, mechanical, or otherwise, may also contain experiences. Not memories in the human sense, but imprints, fragments of extreme conditions repeating themselves without awareness. Heat without fire, sound without movement, smell without source. Not attempting to communicate, simply persisting. Abandoned hospitals and prisons also produce strange reports, but military facilities are unique.
They were built to operate under extreme stress, designed for secrecy, optimized for survival during catastrophe. Everything about them is reinforced: walls thicker, doors heavier, spaces tighter. If environments can retain impressions, then these sites would be ideal vessels. In long-term follow-ups, individuals affected by these sites reported similar changes: heightened sensitivity to confined spaces, difficulty sleeping in complete darkness, sudden waves of heat triggered by unrelated locations, a recurring sense of being observed from behind. Not fear, awareness. Many never returned to abandoned locations of any kind. Some changed careers, some isolated themselves. A few refused to discuss the experiences at all. Across every case, explorers, photographers, guards, locals, one statement appears again and again, not word for word, but meaning for meaning. It didn't feel like something followed me. It felt like something was activated, as if the act of entering had started something and leaving didn't stop it. As more accounts surfaced, skepticism followed. It always does. Psychologists pointed to delayed stress responses. Environmental scientists suggested chemical residue and exposure. Neurologists spoke of sensory memory and subconscious association. On paper, each explanation made sense, until they were tested against the details. If chemical exposure were the cause, symptoms would appear immediately, not weeks later. If stress were the trigger, fear would come first, not calm curiosity. If imagination played the central role, the details wouldn't align so closely across people who never spoke to one another. Yet across abandoned military sites, the same elements return: heat with no measurable source, smell without material origin, sensations beginning only after departure, long-term psychological shifts, and perhaps most unsettling of all, the sites involved were rarely random. They were places built to contain something. When researchers mapped reported cases, clusters emerged: former weapons storage depots, missile control facilities, radar and early warning stations, underground research installations. Sites tied not to combat, but to preparation. Preparation for events that never came, or events that were never made public.
In many cases, records from these locations remain partially classified to this day. What happened inside them is still unknown. Some witnesses shared their experiences openly, others didn't. A small number cut all contact after coming forward: emails unanswered, phone numbers disconnected. In follow-up attempts, researchers were sometimes told the same thing: they don't want to talk about it anymore. Not because they were frightened, but because revisiting the experience seemed to reactivate it. In several interviews, a question was asked near the end: if you could go back and stop yourself from entering that site, would you? Almost all answered the same way: yes. Not because of what they saw, but because of what changed. They described a subtle shift, an awareness they couldn't switch off, as though they'd glimpsed something meant to remain sealed. Not dangerous, not alive, just unfinished. What if these places are still doing what they were built to do? Military facilities are not neutral spaces. They are engineered environments, designed to isolate, to suppress, to contain. If even a fraction of what these witnesses report is true, then abandonment didn't end their function, it only removed supervision. And perhaps when people enter these places today, they aren't trespassing, they're activating something that never fully shut down. If abandoned military sites can leave lasting effects on the people who enter them, how many others have experienced the same changes and never connected them to the place where it began? These stories don't ask you to believe in ghosts.
They ask you to consider something more uncomfortable, that certain environments remember, and that once you step inside them, they may remember you. If stories like this draw you toward the unexplained edges where history, psychology, and mystery meet, then you're already standing on the Shadowline. Would you ever enter an abandoned military site, knowing what some people carry out with them? Tell us in the comments. Subscribe to Shadowline Mysteries for true accounts that refuse easy answers, and share this story with someone who believes some places are better left unexplored. Because not every mystery wants to be solved. Some only want to be remembered.